Who am I? You know, Stuart Briscoe once said, the more you tell someone who they are, the less you have to tell them what to do. Because you see, identity leads to action. Your action flows from who you are, and every identity comes with a mission. What's really fascinating is that oftentimes people struggle even defining the word I. We don't know who we are, but we become obsessed over the word I, the very thing that we cannot capture. I mean, have you ever looked around at our society and asked the question, why are we obsessed with the letter I? We have iPhones and iPads and iPods, and there's even, I believe it or not, there is even I worship. Like we have eyes everywhere. And one of the things you can always tell is whenever a person or a society is in exile, they're not only obsessed with the letter I, but they can't even define that very letter because they don't know who they are. And in this confusion, in this chaos, people continue to try on different identities. Maybe I am this, and maybe I am that, and maybe I can be. The bottom line is we don't know who we are. And I would love to say that the church was exempt from this. I would love to say, but we're just talking about non-Christians there, because in the church, we can answer this question. In the church, we know who we are. But let's be honest, friends. Even in the church, we struggle. You know, I noticed this around 20 years ago. I mean, we've had this issue for quite some time. But 20 years ago, in 2002, a pastor in California by the name of Rick Warren publishes this best-selling book called The Purpose-Driven Life. And this book sold millions of copies to Christians. And here's why I find that fascinating. Because the question that is on the front of the book, the question that drew everyone in, was this question: what on earth am I here for? What on earth am I here for? That's the question he's asking and answering in the book. And the thing that I found deeply disturbing is that this book sold millions of copies to Christians who apparently can't answer that question. What on earth am I here for? You will always struggle with purpose. You will always struggle with your actions. You will always struggle as a Christian if you cannot answer the question, who am I? Who am I? Because if you don't know who you are, you will have no clue what to do. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking, now wait a minute. I thought we were talking about the book of Daniel. What in the world are we going on and on and on about the question, who am I? I'll get there. I'll connect this to Daniel, I promise. Just not yet. Because one of the things we need to do is we need to back up and we need to take a running start at this book of Daniel. We need to look at the story before the story. And sure, there are a lot of different events that went on, but there is an event that went on that oftentimes we don't associate with identity, but it was centered on it. Because what the Exodus was all about was the identity of God's people. The identity of this group of people that was caught under the oppression of the Egyptians, that was caught in this bondage. And for 400 years, they cried out, who are we? God, have you forgotten your covenant with Joseph? Have you forgotten your covenant with Abraham? Have you forgotten us? And without you, who are we? And one of the things that is fascinating is the only way you can answer this question, who am I? Is if you're able to answer the question that Moses asked to God at the burning bush. You remember the story. Moses, he was born an Israelite. He was born a Hebrew. But there was an edict that was put out that all the babies were going to be executed. And so Moses' mother puts him in the Nile in a basket, and he floats into the very heart of Pharaoh's home, the very heart of Egypt. And Moses grows up royalty until one day he ends up intervening with an Egyptian that is beating this Hebrew, and he kills the Egyptian. And the next day, he sees two Hebrews, they're arguing, and he goes up to try to intervene. And one of them looks at and says, "Aren't you that murderer?" And so what does Moses do? Well, he does what a lot of us do whenever we're caught red-handed. He runs. He runs into the wilderness. He runs into the desert. And for 40 years, he is running from his past. He is running from his present. He's running from his identity as a child of God. And then one day, whenever Moses is out there in the desert, he comes across a burning bush. Now, in the desert, things burn up, so he wasn't shocked. But one of the things that bothered him is that it kept burning and burning, but it would not actually burn up all the way. So he goes over to investigate when all of a sudden a voice from inside of the bush begins to speak. Moses realizes, I'm on holy ground, but then it gets even weirder for him. Because the voice inside of the bush says, "Moses, I have a mission for you. I want you to go back to Egypt and set my people free." And Moses has this weird moment where he's like, are you sure you got the right guy? And God's like, I'm God. I'm perfect. I don't make mistakes like that. And he's like, well, maybe it was somebody else wandering in the desert. I'm like, that's not likely because there's not a whole lot of people out here. And finally, God goes, no, listen, I've chosen you. I want you to go set my people free. And then Moses asks this question. He asks this piercing question in Exodus chapter 3, verse 13. Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and I say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you.' And they ask me, 'Well, what is his name?' What am I supposed to say? The burning bush guy? I don't even know your name." See, Moses was tapping into something that's very important for us to get here at the very first session of this series on Daniel. You will never be able to answer the question of who am I if you cannot answer the question, who is God? And as the plagues start to fall, and as the Red Sea splits and the people of God walk through, it's easy to forget that what the Exodus is all about is about identity. About claiming this group of people and crafting them into the people of God. For when they go out into the wilderness, they also receive the 10 Commandments. And in Exodus chapter 20, verse 2, this is how the first commandment begins. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, who brought you out of the land of slavery." You see, even at the beginning of the 10 Commandments, God says, you need to know who I am. Why? Because the answer to the question of who is God gives us the ability to answer the question, who am I? Now, let's talk about how this connects to Daniel. And I know some of you are probably thinking, finally, hippie, we're like 8 minutes into this. Yeah, let's move to the book of Daniel. But in order to understand how this connects to the book of Daniel, you need to understand that we are nowhere near the Exodus any longer when we come to Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. A lot has happened between then. You've had the monarchy, the kingdom established. David reigns. He is now gone. Solomon is gone. And in Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, we find ourselves in a different land. We find ourselves in exile. And if exile is about anything, exile is about the loss of identity, not the finding of it. Listen to Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, how this book begins. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. He destroyed it. Verse 2, and the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. And these articles from the temple he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, into the temple of Marduk. And he put them in the treasure house of his God. If you don't read those first two verses with the strain of a heart, with a voice on the verge of tears, you're not understanding how the book of Daniel begins. You're not understanding the importance of the exile. You're not understanding what all 12 of these chapters are trying to do. For if Daniel is about anything, the book of Daniel is about identity. It is about identity that has been lost. For the Exodus has now transformed into the exile, and the exile is the Exodus in reverse. For everything they received in the Exodus, the promised land, everything that they acquired in the Exodus, the law, the temple, sacrifices, atonement, identity as people of God, is now being challenged, is now being confused, is now being thrown into such incredible upheaval that even when they tell the story, they begin to weep. You know, Psalm 137 is a really fascinating psalm because it was written during the time of Daniel. It was written in exile. And it is a song filled with anguish. For it says that we are on the banks of Babylon, and they are crying out to us, "Sing us one of your songs, O Israel." And the psalmist says, "But how can we sing when we are no longer in the land of our God?" The exile is the Exodus in reverse. And here at the beginning of this 11-session series, here at the beginning of the 12 chapters of the book of Daniel, we need to make sure that we do not get confused, because I tell you what, some of the images in this book get wild. Once we get to chapters 7 through 12, we're going to see beasts coming out of the sea. We're going to see a ram and a goat, the fighting. We're going to see a lot of wild images, but it's also going to be surrounded with a lot of incredible stories. Like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, with their faith being put into the fiery furnace. With the dreams of Nebuchadnezzar and the way that Daniel serves even a foreign king as if he longs for him to be a friend. And yet all throughout these chapters, however familiar the stories might be or however foreign the images might appear, you need to remember this simple truth. The book of Daniel is about identity. And if you don't know who you are, you will have no idea what to do. In life, in loss, in an exodus, or in an exile. It's one of the reasons why for about 18 to 20 years, my 4 kids have been growing, but for the first about 8 years of each of their lives, whenever I would take them to school, I would go through the same mantra, go through the same rhythmic way of talking. I would always ask this question. So I'll use the name of my youngest right now because that's the one I'm still doing it with. I say, "Hey, Robert, who are we?" And he kind of sighs and goes, "We're the Wood family." And I say, "And who's the Wood family?" "We're Christians." And I say, "What do Christians do?" Christians, they don't lie, they don't kick, they don't hit anybody with their words or with their feet or with their hands. And then I always say this, I say, "Robert, remember who you are. Remember who you are." And as my kids have gotten older, I no longer have to go through the entire mantra. Instead, whenever my oldest or my daughter or my other son are going out with some of their friends, before they leave and I give them a hug, I always look at them in the eye and I say, "Hey, remember who you are." Why do I do this? Because I genuinely believe that if you know who you are, you will know what to do and you will know what not to do. If you know who you are, you will be reminded of who you belong to. And in an exile, identity is exactly what you need to fight for and hopefully remember.